Few names in modern history evoke such immediate horror. To many, he is remembered only as the man responsible for the Cambodian genocide, the architect of a regime that wiped out nearly a quarter of his own people in less than 4 years. The killing fields, the mass graves, the silence of a broken nation. Yet before the terror, before the bloodshed, Pol Pot was simply Saloth Sar, a boy born into comfort, education, and privilege. So how did a child of wealth and opportunity become one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century? Pol Pot was born in the village of Prek Sbao, outside the city of Kampong Thom. He was named Saloth Sar, the word Sar, white, pale, referencing his comparatively light skin complexion. French colonial records placed his birth date on 25 May 1928, but biographer Philip Short argues he was born in March 1925. Given the age that we know that Saloth began his education, the latter date of 1928 seems more likely. He was known as Saloth Sar for over 30 years, and as we will see, the name Pol Pot was a revolutionary pseudonym which he gradually began using during the 1960s, one of many he later employed, although it was the one by which he was most commonly known. His family was of mixed Chinese and ethnic Khmer heritage, but did not speak Chinese and lived as though they were fully Khmer. His father, Loth, who later took the name Saloth Fem, was a prosperous farmer who owned 9 hectares, 22 acres, of rice land and several draft cattle. Loth's house was one of the largest in the village, and at transplanting and harvest time, he hired poorer neighbors to carry out much of the agricultural labor. Sar's mother, Sok Nem, was locally respected as a pious Buddhist. Sar was the 8th of 9 children, 2 girls and 7 boys, 3 of whom died young. They were raised as Theravada Buddhists and on festivals traveled to the Kampong Thom monastery. Despite his family's relatively prosperous origins, in an interview with Yugoslav television in 1977, Pol Pot claimed that he was born into a poor peasant family. At the time, Cambodia was a monarchy, but the French colonial regime held effective political control of the country. Sar's family had connections to the Cambodian royalty. His cousin, Miak, was a consort of King Sisowath Monavong and later worked as a ballet teacher. When Sar was 6 years old, he and an older brother were sent to live with Miak in Phnom Penh. Informal adoptions by wealthier relatives were common in Cambodia. In Phnom Penh, he spent 18 months as a novice monk in the city's Wat Botum Vade monastery, learning Buddhist teachings and to read and write the Khmer language. In the 9th century, a powerful state began to take shape in Cambodia, the Khmer Empire, named after the Khmer-speaking people of the region. Over the centuries that followed, it grew into the dominant power in Southeast Asia. At its height, during the 12th and 13th centuries, its capital at Angkor may have been home to nearly 1 million people. But this golden age did not last. The empire gradually declined, and by the 16th and 17th centuries, Cambodia had faded into a weakened state, caught between its stronger neighbors, Siam and Vietnam. Because of this long decline, it was not surprising that Cambodia was easily absorbed by France in 1867, becoming part of French Indochina. The transition to colonial rule was relatively peaceful. The French kept the Cambodian monarchy in place, but only as a puppet institution. By the time Pol Pot was born, Cambodia was a French protectorate, a country under foreign control, though one that experienced modest improvements in living standards and food security under European administration. This fragile situation was further shaken during the Second World War. In October 1940, neighboring Thailand invaded Cambodia and Laos, seizing several border provinces from the French. Then, in April 1941, King Monivong, the French-backed monarch of Cambodia, died. The French replaced him with Norodom Sihanouk, an 18-year-old prince they believed would be easier to control than the designated successor, Prince Monireth. However, Sihanouk would soon prove far less obedient than expected, and he would go on to dominate Cambodian politics for the next 70 years.
Almost immediately after his coronation, Cambodia was drawn into the wider war in Asia. The Japanese Empire occupied the country as World War II spread across the region. Cambodia endured 4 years of Japanese control. As the war neared its end, Sihanouk declared an independent Kingdom of Kampuchea in March 1945. This independence was short-lived. By October of that year, French colonial rule had been restored. Still, this brief moment of independence foreshadowed the long struggle to end foreign domination that lay ahead.
Thanks to family connections, Saloth Sar was sent to Phnom Penh at a young age. He lived in a Buddhist monastery where he absorbed strict discipline and religious teaching. Later, he attended French colonial schools alongside the children of European administrators. But academically, Sar struggled. He lagged behind his peers, showed little interest in study, and preferred sports over scholarship. Still, privilege carried him forward. Despite repeated academic failures, he gained admission to elite institutions, not through talent, but through connections. Over the roughly 80 years following the beginning of French rule, Cambodia's population more than quadrupled, rising from just under 1 million people to well over 4 million by the middle of the 20th century. Pol Pot's family benefited greatly during this period. They possessed extensive connections within the Cambodian administration, including ties to the royal family itself. It was through these connections that the young Saloth Sar was able, in 1934, to secure a place as a novice monk at the Buddhist monastery of Vath Botum Vade in Phnom Penh. There, he studied Buddhist teachings and religious literature. Yet the most lasting influence of this period may not have been spiritual, but rather his exposure to strict discipline and rigid hierarchy. In 1935, Sar was sent to a Roman Catholic primary school, a colonial institution where he studied alongside the children of French administrators. Academically, he struggled. He showed little interest in his lessons, preferring sport over study. As a result, he did not complete primary school until 1941, graduating 2 years later than expected. Despite these setbacks, his background continued to work in his favor. In 1942, even with a poor academic record, Sar was admitted to a prestigious boarding school supported by the Cambodian monarchy. He remained there until 1947, once again devoting far more energy to football and basketball than to his studies. While Pol Pot was passing through these schools, the political landscape around him was changing rapidly. With the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in 1939, French colonial authority across Southeast Asia began to weaken, setting the stage for profound political upheaval in Cambodia. This pattern would define much of his life. While Sar was at the school, King Monivong died. In 1941, the French authorities appointed Norodom Sihanouk as his replacement. A new junior middle school, the Collège Prayam Sihanouk, was established in Kampong Cham, and Sar was selected as a boarder at the institution in 1942. This level of education afforded him a privileged position in Cambodian society. He learned to play the violin and took part in school plays. Much of his spare time was spent playing football, soccer, and basketball. Several fellow pupils, among them Hu Nim and Khieu Sampan, later served in his government. During the New Year vacation in 1945, Sar and several friends from his college theater troupe went on a provincial tour in a bus to raise money for a trip to Angkor Wat. In 1947, he left the school. That year, he passed exams that admitted him into the Lycée Sisawat, meanwhile living with Song and his new wife. In summer 1948, he sat the brevet entry examinations for the upper classes of the Lycée Sisawat, but failed. Unlike several of his friends, he could not continue on at the school for a baccalaureate.
Instead, he enrolled in 1948 to study carpentry at the École Technique in Rusaykeo, in Phnom Penh's northern suburbs. This drop from an academic education to a vocational one likely came as a shock. His fellow students were generally of a lower class than those at the Lycée Sisawat, though they were not peasants. At the École Technique, he met Ieng Sari, who became a close friend and later a member of his government. In summer 1949, Sar passed his brevet and secured one of 5 scholarships, allowing him to travel to France to study at one of its engineering schools.
In the years following the war, Pol Pot's own path began to pull him away from Cambodia. After leaving boarding school without completing his studies or earning a baccalaureate, he enrolled in 1948 in a carpentry course at a technical college in Phnom Penh. For the son of a wealthy landowner, vocational training as a carpenter would have been considered a step down in Cambodian society at the time. Yet, once again, his background worked in his favor. His academic failures were overlooked, and in 1949, he was awarded a prestigious scholarship to study engineering in Paris, the heart of the French colonial world. Sending the sons of well-connected colonial families to France was a common French strategy. The goal was to expose them to French culture and values, and in doing so, encourage loyalty to French rule rather than demands for independence. Pol Pot left for Paris in 1949 under this system. However, the political climate of post-war Cambodia meant that his time in Europe would have the opposite effect. Instead of becoming a supporter of French colonialism, he would grow increasingly radicalized against it. Before examining Pol Pot's years in Europe, it is important to note what was happening back home. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, King Sihanouk had begun pressing the French government for greater autonomy for Cambodia, a struggle that would soon reshape the country's future. During the Second World War, Nazi Germany invaded France, and in 1941, the Japanese ousted the French from Cambodia, with Sihanouk proclaiming his country's independence. After the war ended, France reasserted its control over Cambodia in 1946, but allowed for the creation of a new constitution and the establishment of various political parties. The most successful of these was the Democratic Party, which won the 1946 general election. According to historian David Chandler, Sar and Sari worked for the party during its successful election campaign. Conversely, Short maintains that Sar had no contact with the party. Sihanouk opposed the party's left-leaning reforms and in 1948 dissolved the National Assembly, instead ruling by decree. The Viet Minh attempted to establish a nascent communist movement, but it was beset by ethnic tensions between the Khmer and Vietnamese. News of the group was censored from the press, and it is unlikely Sar was aware of it. Access to higher education abroad placed Saleth Sar among a tiny and highly privileged elite in Cambodia. In 1949, he was selected as one of just 22 Cambodian students chosen to study in France. The group departed from Saigon aboard the SS Jamaica, stopping at Singapore, Colombo, and Djibouti before finally reaching Marseille. From there, Sar traveled north, arriving in Paris on October 1, 1949. In January 1950, he enrolled at the École Française de Radio-Électricité, where he studied radio electronics. During his time in Paris, Sar lived in several modest accommodations. He first stayed at the Indo-Chinese Pavilion in the Cité Universitaire, then moved to lodgings on Rue Amiot, and later to a small bedsit near the corner of Rue de Commerce and Rue Le Tellier. Academically, Sar's performance was mixed. He earned solid marks during his first year, but failed his end-of-year examinations. However, he was permitted to resit them and narrowly passed, allowing him to continue his studies. Sar spent 3 years in Paris, years that would prove formative in unexpected ways. In the summer of 1950, he joined 17 other Cambodian students in traveling to Yugoslavia, where they volunteered in a labor battalion building a motorway near Zagreb. He returned to Yugoslavia the following summer for a camping holiday. Despite living in France, Sarr made little effort to fully assimilate into French society and was never completely comfortable with the French language. Nonetheless, he developed an appreciation for French literature, particularly the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who became one of his favorite authors. More important than his academic life were the relationships he formed. His closest friendships were with Ieng Sary, who joined him in Paris, as well as Thun Mum and Kang van Sak. Sarr became part of van Sak's discussion circle, a politically diverse group that debated ideas about nationalism, revolution, and how Cambodia might one day achieve independence. It was in Paris that Sarr's political radicalization truly began. Along with Ieng Sary and others, Cambodian students established the Cercle Marxiste, or Marxist Circle, a secret organization structured around clandestine cells. These cells met regularly to read Marxist texts and conduct sessions of ideological self-criticism. Sarr joined a cell that met on Rue La Cepede, alongside figures such as Hu Yuan, Cien Ari, and Sok Knal. Sarr also assisted in producing the group's newspaper, Rexme, meaning the Spark, a deliberate reference to a revolutionary Russian publication. In October 1951, Hu Yuan was elected head of the Khmer Student Association, forging close ties between Cambodian students and the left-wing National Union of French students. Through careful manipulation, the Cercle Marxiste would exert influence over the association and its successors for nearly 2 decades. Several months after the Circle's creation, both Sarr and Ieng Sary joined the French Communist Party. Sarr attended party meetings, including those of its Cambodian section, and regularly read its journal, Le Cahier International. At the time, communism appeared to many young people in both France and Cambodia as the ideology of the future. The Chinese Communist Party had just won the Chinese Civil War, and in France, the Communist Party was one of the country's largest political forces, commanding roughly a quarter of the national vote. For Salot Sa, Paris was not simply a place of education, it was where revolutionary ideas began to eclipse academic ambition, and where the foundations of a far more radical future were laid. Sarr struggled with many of Karl Marx's more complex writings, later admitting that he didn't really understand them. However, he became well acquainted with the works of Joseph Stalin, particularly The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, which presented revolution as a disciplined and centralized process. He also studied the writings of Mao Zedong, especially on New Democracy. This text outlined a revolutionary strategy designed specifically for colonial and semi-colonial, semi-feudal societies, and it would leave a lasting impression on Sarr. Alongside these works, he read The Great Revolution by the anarchist Peter Kropotkin, A History of the French Revolution. From Kropotkin, Sarr absorbed several key ideas: that revolution required an alliance between intellectuals and the peasantry, that it must be pursued without compromise, and that radical equality was the foundation of a communist society. These concepts, drawn from different ideological traditions, would later merge into his own distinct and extreme vision of revolution. While Sarr was in Europe, Cambodia itself was sliding deeper into political turmoil. Growing internal unrest led King Norodom Sihanouk to dismiss the government and appoint himself prime minister. In response, Sarr wrote an article titled Monarchy or Democracy, which was published in the student magazine Khmer Nisut under the pseudonym Khmer Daum, meaning Original Khmer. In the article, he spoke positively of Buddhism, portraying Buddhist monks as natural opponents of monarchy and allies of the peasantry. His writing reflected an emerging blend of nationalism, revolutionary politics, and selective ideological interpretation. As the situation in Cambodia worsened, members of the Cercle Marxist Khmer met to decide whether one of them should return home to assess events on the ground and determine which rebel movement deserved support. Sarr volunteered for the mission.
His decision was likely influenced not only by political conviction, but also by practical necessity. He had failed his second-year examinations twice, resulting in the loss of his scholarship. In December, Sarr boarded the SS Jamaica and sailed back to Cambodia. He returned without a degree, but with a growing sense of revolutionary purpose that would soon reshape his life and the fate of his country.
Sarr arrived in Saigon, today's Ho Chi Minh City, on 13 January 1953. Coincidentally, it was the very same day that King Norodom Sihanouk dissolved the democratic-controlled National Assembly, began ruling by decree, and ordered the arrest of democratic members of parliament without trial. Cambodia was entering a new and dangerous phase. Across French Indochina, the First Indochina War was raging, and Cambodia itself was sliding into civil conflict. Violence was widespread, with massacres and atrocities committed by all sides. In this unstable environment, Sarr spent several months at the headquarters of Prince Norodom Chantarangse, one of the leaders of the armed resistance, based in Trapang Kulong. He later moved on to Phnom Penh, where he met with fellow Circle Marxiste member Ping Se to assess the political situation. After careful consideration, Sarr concluded that the Khmer Viet Minh, a mixed Cambodian and Vietnamese guerrilla force aligned with the Viet Minh in North Vietnam, represented the most promising revolutionary movement. He believed their direct connection to the Viet Minh, and through it to the wider international communist movement, made them the strongest candidate for support. The Cercle Marxiste in Paris accepted his recommendation. In August 1953, Sarr and Rath Samoan traveled to Krabao, the headquarters of the Viet Minh's Eastern Zone. Over the next 9 months, around a dozen other Circle members joined them there. What they encountered, however, was revealing. The Khmer Viet Minh was largely controlled and numerically dominated by Vietnamese fighters, while Cambodian recruits were often assigned menial roles. Sarr himself was tasked with growing cassava and working in the camp canteen. Despite this, his time at Krabao proved significant. He gained a basic working knowledge of the Vietnamese language and gradually rose in responsibility, eventually becoming secretary and aide to Tu Samut, the secretary of the Khmer Viet Minh's Eastern Zone. Meanwhile, political developments were unfolding rapidly. Determined to secure independence, Sihanouk renewed pressure on France. When his demands were rejected, he called for public resistance in June 1953. Large numbers of Khmer soldiers deserted the French army, and, faced with the prospect of a prolonged and costly war, the French government relented. In November 1953, Sihanouk formally declared Cambodia's independence. Rather than bringing peace, independence intensified the internal conflict. France now backed Sihanouk in his campaign against rebel forces. Following the Geneva Conference, which ended the First Indochina War, Sihanouk secured an agreement from North Vietnam to withdraw Khmer Viet Minh units from Cambodian territory. By October 1954, the last of these forces had departed for North Vietnam. Sarr chose not to go with them. Instead, he remained in Cambodia. Traveling on foot through South Vietnam, he made his way to Pre Veng, and from there returned to Phnom Penh. There, he and other Cambodian revolutionaries made a strategic decision. For the time being, they would pursue their political goals through electoral and legal means rather than armed struggle. It was a temporary shift in strategy, one that would not last. Cambodia's communists sought to operate in secrecy, but they also created a legal political party, Prachiachon, to serve as a front organization through which they could contest the 1955 national election. Although Prachiachon enjoyed strong local support in certain regions, most observers believed the Democratic Party would emerge victorious. This prospect alarmed King Norodom Sihanouk. Fearing a Democratic Party government, he abdicated the throne in March 1955, handing power to his father, Norodom Suramaret. This maneuver allowed Sihanouk to legally form his own political movement, the Sangku Riastra Neum, and contest the election himself.
The September 1955 election was marked by widespread intimidation, violence, and electoral fraud. When the results were announced, Sangkum had won all 91 seats in the National Assembly. With this outcome, Sihanouk effectively established a one-party state, extinguishing any realistic hope that Cambodia's left could gain power through democratic means. Despite this setback, the government of North Vietnam advised the Khmer Communist movement not to resume armed struggle. Hanoi was focused on undermining South Vietnam and had little interest in destabilizing Cambodia, especially since Sihanouk's regime had remained officially non-aligned, unlike the governments of Thailand and South Vietnam, which were closely allied with the United States.
During this period, Sar settled into civilian life in Phnom Penh, renting a house in the Bun Kang Kang district. Although he lacked formal qualifications to teach in state schools, he secured a position at a private institution, Chamraun Viche, meaning progressive knowledge. There, he taught history, geography, French literature, and moral philosophy. Former students, including the future novelist Soth Po Lin, later described him as a capable and respected teacher. In his personal life, Sar initially courted the socialite Seung Son Ma Lee before beginning a relationship with fellow revolutionary Kiyu Ponari, the sister of Yang Sari's wife, Kiyu Thirit. The couple were married in a Buddhist ceremony on 14 July 1956. According to historian Philip Short, Sar deliberately chose the date to coincide with Bastille Day, the symbolic anniversary of the French Revolution. Politically, Sar occupied a central role behind the scenes. All correspondence between the Democratic Party and Prachiachon passed through him, as did much of the communication between legal political actors and the underground communist network. However, Sihanouk soon intensified his crackdown on left-wing groups, whose membership had already fallen by half since the end of the civil conflict. At the same time, ties with the North Vietnamese communists weakened. Sar later portrayed this development as beneficial, arguing that it gave us the chance to be independent and develop ourselves. Increasingly, he and his comrades came to view Cambodian revolutionaries as overly deferential to their Vietnamese counterparts. To address this, Sar, Tu Samut, and Nuon Che drafted a new program and set of statutes for a party that would be aligned with, but not subordinate to, Vietnam. They began establishing small, tightly controlled party cells, prioritizing the recruitment of committed members, and organized political seminars in safe houses across the country. Quietly, methodically, a new revolutionary movement was taking shape beneath the surface of Cambodian society. In 1959, members of the Marxist-Leninist Cambodian movement established the Kampuchean Labor Party, the forerunner of what would later become the infamous Khmer Rouge. In late September, 21 senior members of the party, including Pol Pot, met in a room of a railway station in Phnom Penh. Here, they agreed to rename the new party as the Workers' Party of Kampuchea, and party positions were allocated, structured along the Marxist-Leninist principle of democratic centralism. The party was led by a four-man General Affairs Committee consisting of Sar, Tu Samut, Nuon Che, and one other senior figure. Its very existence was to remain strictly secret, hidden from all but its members. Sihanouk's regime, however, faced pressure not only from the left, but also from the right. A rival opposition emerged around Sam Sari, a former minister backed by the United States, Thailand, and South Vietnam. After South Vietnamese support for a failed coup attempt against Sihanouk, relations between Phnom Penh and Washington deteriorated sharply. In 1956, the United States imposed an economic blockade on Cambodia. Following the death of his father in 1960, Sihanouk amended the constitution to allow himself to become head of state for life, further consolidating his authority. Political tensions continued to rise. In February 1962, student protests against the government escalated into riots.
In response, Sihanouk dismissed the Sankum government, called new elections, and compiled a list of 34 left-leaning Cambodians, summoning them to meet with him to form a new administration. Sar's name was on the list, possibly because of his public role as a schoolteacher. He refused to attend. Instead, he and Ieng Sari fled Phnom Penh, traveling to a Viet Cong encampment near Tabung Khmum, deep in the jungle along Cambodia's border with South Vietnam. As historian David Chandler later observed, from this point on, he was a full-time revolutionary. The party's next major conference took place clandestinely in Phnom Penh between September and October 1960. Tu Samuth was made General Secretary, while his ally Nuon Chea was appointed as his deputy. But Pol Pot was elected to the bureau and was effectively third in command of the new Revolutionary Party. He would not have to wait long before he ascended to a position of leadership when Tu Samuth was killed by the Cambodian government. At the same time, Prince Norodom Sihanouk began speaking out more openly against Cambodia's communist movement. He warned of its totalitarian nature and its hostility to personal freedom. In January 1962, Sihanouk's security forces launched a renewed crackdown on the left, arresting the leaders of Prachia Chon and effectively neutralizing the party. The repression soon turned lethal. In July 1962, Tu Samuth was arrested, tortured, and killed while in custody. Nuon Chea had already withdrawn from active political life, leaving a clear path for Sa to rise to the top of the party leadership. Less than 2 years later, Pol Pot would be elected as his successor, and as the second in command, Nuon Chea decided to step back from the revolutionary struggle. But Samuth's death was also part of a wider crackdown on the socialist movement in Cambodia. And even before Pol Pot had officially been appointed as the new head of the Workers' Party, he was forced to flee with his wife to a Viet Cong encampment near the border between Cambodia and South Vietnam. It was the beginning of the drift towards civil war and the horrors that followed in its aftermath in Cambodia. Pol Pot spent the next half a decade largely living in encampments in the jungles of Cambodia and Vietnam. His personality as a dictator was formed during these years. He was a somewhat enigmatic character, one who displayed a large level of self-control and was reserved and introspective. Nevertheless, despite his taciturn character and the deplorable nature of his later crimes, many are agreed that he could be charming when a situation necessitated him to be so. While his varied upbringing and middle years had seen him develop an ability to interact with people from many walks of life, yet behind the apparently amiable facade lay an individual with a great thirst for power, a propensity for savage violence, and a personality that was increasingly paranoid. None of this was alleviated in any fashion by his personal circumstances. His wife suffered from deteriorating mental health in the 1960s, which would descend into chronic schizophrenia in the 1970s.
Pol Pot and she would eventually divorce in 1979, and although he remarried later in life, he never enjoyed much of a family life, having just one child, a daughter who was born in the mid-1980s, when he was in his late 50s. Equally, he suffered from very poor health throughout his adult life, with insomnia and intestinal ailments, conditions which would have done nothing beneficial to stabilize an already erratic personality. Above all, if we are to seek to discover who Pol Pot was and what motivated him, we must remember that he was an ardent Cambodian nationalist and one whose tendencies in this regard were heightened in the 1960s as he built up opposition to Sihanouk's regime in the wayward north and east of the country. And if there is any consistency to his actions, it is surely found in his zealous desire for Cambodian independence from French rule, and the monarchy epitomized by Sihanouk. In January 1968, the conflict escalated into open war.
the first major attack struck the Bay Dameron Army Post, south of Battambang. Further assaults soon followed, targeting police stations and military units, with the rebels seizing weapons and supplies to arm their growing forces. The government responded with scorched earth tactics, launching aerial bombardments against areas believed to shelter insurgents. Rather than crushing the rebellion, the army's brutality often had the opposite effect. As villages were destroyed and civilians targeted, support for the insurgents surged. The uprising spread rapidly, and more than 100,000 villagers were soon drawn into the movement. During the summer, SAR relocated his headquarters 48 kilometers north to the rugged, mountainous region known as Naga's Tail to evade advancing government troops. The new base, known as K5, became the center of his growing power. From there, he tightened his control over the party, establishing a separate encampment complete with his own staff and armed guards. No one was permitted to meet him without an escort, reinforcing his authority and isolation. At K5, SAR replaced Ieng Sari as secretary of the Northeast Zone, further consolidating his leadership. By November 1969, he set out on a dangerous journey to Hanoi, hoping to secure direct military assistance from North Vietnam. His efforts failed. Vietnamese leaders refused, urging him instead to abandon armed struggle and return to political methods. In January 1970, SAR traveled onward to Beijing. During this period, troubling signs emerged in his personal life. His wife began to display early symptoms of what would later be diagnosed as chronic paranoid schizophrenia. In March 1970, while SAR was still in Beijing, events in Cambodia took a dramatic turn. Led by General Lon Nol, Cambodian parliamentarians deposed Prince Norodom Sihanouk while he was abroad, bringing an abrupt end to his rule. Sihanouk flew to Beijing, where leaders of the Chinese and North Vietnamese Communist parties urged him to form an alliance with the Khmer Rouge in order to overthrow Lon Nol's newly established right-wing government. Sihanouk agreed. Acting on the advice of Premier Zhou Enlai, SAR also consented to the alliance, although his true authority within the Communist Party of Cambodia was deliberately concealed from Sihanouk. From exile in Beijing, Sihanouk established a government in exile and announced the creation of the National United Front of Cambodia, calling on Cambodians to resist the Lon Nol regime. His endorsement proved decisive. Backed by the prestige of the monarchy, the Khmer Rouge experienced a dramatic surge in recruitment. Many of the new fighters were rural peasants, politically unaligned and largely unfamiliar with communist ideology. They fought not for revolution, but for the king. In April 1970, SAR traveled to Hanoi. He made clear to Le Duan, the general secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party, that while he welcomed weapons and logistical support, he did not want Vietnamese troops fighting on Cambodian soil. In SAR's view, Cambodians had to defeat Lon Nol's military government on their own. Despite these assurances, North Vietnamese forces, alongside the Viet Cong, soon entered Cambodia to attack Lon Nol's army. In response, South Vietnam and the United States sent troops to support the Cambodian government. Cambodia was now fully drawn into the expanding Second Indochina War. The consequences were devastating. During the conflict, the United States dropped more bombs on Cambodia than it had on Japan during the entirety of World War II. Although officially aimed at Viet Cong and Khmer Rouge bases, the bombing overwhelmingly affected civilian populations. Entire villages were destroyed, and tens of thousands were displaced or killed. Rather than weakening the insurgency, the destruction fueled it. The suffering of the countryside drove thousands into the arms of the Khmer Rouge. By the end of 1970, the movement had approximately 12,000 full-time fighters. By 1972, that number had quadrupled, setting the stage for the final phase of Cambodia's descent into catastrophe. In June 1970, SAR left Vietnam and returned to his base at K5. The following month, he moved south. It was during this period that he began referring to himself simply as Pol, a name he would later expand into Pol Pot. By September, he had established himself at a camp along the border between Kratie and Kampong Thom. There, he convened a meeting of the Standing Committee of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. Attendance was limited. Many senior figures were unable to reach the site, but the meeting nonetheless produced a significant resolution. It set out the principle of independence mastery, asserting that Cambodia must be self-reliant and fully independent of all foreign powers, including its revolutionary allies. In November, Pol Pot, Q Ponari, and their entourage relocated once again, this time to the K1 base at Dang Da. His residence was established on the northern bank of the Chinit River, and access was tightly controlled. Entry was strictly regulated, reinforcing both security and Pol Pot's growing authority. By the end of 1970, Marxist forces had established a presence in more than half of Cambodia. Yet the role of the Khmer Rouge remained limited. Throughout 1971 and 1972, the bulk of the fighting against Lon Nol's government was carried out either by Vietnamese forces or by Cambodian units operating under Vietnamese command. In January 1971, a Central Committee meeting was held at the K1 base, bringing together 27 delegates to assess the war and the movement's future direction. Over the course of that year, Pol Pot and the party's senior leadership concentrated on building a regular Khmer Rouge army and a parallel administrative structure, institutions designed to assume full control once Vietnamese forces withdrew. Party membership was tightened. Recruitment became more selective, favoring those classified as poor peasants, while excluding middle peasants, students, and intellectuals, who were increasingly viewed with suspicion. In July and August 1971, Pol Pot personally supervised a month-long political and military training course for Communist Party cadres at the Northern Zone headquarters. This effort culminated in the Third Congress of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, attended by approximately 60 delegates. At the Congress, Pol Pot was formally confirmed as Secretary of the Central Committee and Chairman of the party's Military Commission. By this point, his leadership was no longer provisional. The foundations of absolute power had been laid.
In early 1972, Pol Pot set out on his first tour of the Marxist-controlled regions of Cambodia. These territories, known as the Liberated Zones, were presented as model societies. Corruption was officially eliminated, gambling was outlawed, and alcohol consumption and extramarital relationships were strongly discouraged. Between 1970 and 1971, the Khmer Rouge had generally tried to maintain positive relations with the local population. They organized village elections and public assemblies to give the appearance of popular participation. Although some individuals deemed hostile to the movement were executed, such cases were still relatively rare at this stage. Private vehicles were confiscated, and land owned by wealthier peasants was redistributed. By the end of 1972, every family living in the Marxist-controlled areas was allocated an equal amount of land. As a result, the poorest segments of Cambodian society initially benefited from these reforms. From 1972 onward, the Khmer Rouge began a far more radical transformation, seeking to remake all of Cambodia in the image of the poor peasantry. Rural isolation, self-sufficiency, and extreme simplicity were promoted as revolutionary ideals. In May 1972, people living under Khmer Rouge control were ordered to dress like poor peasants, black clothing, red and white krama scarves, and sandals made from recycled car tires. These rules were first imposed on the Cham ethnic group and later extended to the wider population.
Pol Pot himself adopted this style of dress. Within the Communist Party of Kampuchea, CPK, members were required to attend frequent, sometimes daily, lifestyle meetings. During these sessions, individuals were expected to publicly criticize themselves and others. This practice created an atmosphere of constant surveillance, fear, and mutual suspicion. Pol Pot and Nuon Chea presided over these meetings at party headquarters, though they themselves were never subject to criticism. By early 1972, relations between the Khmer Rouge and their Vietnamese Marxist allies had begun to deteriorate, leading to occasional violent clashes. That same year, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong main force units started withdrawing from Cambodia, primarily to prepare for major operations against Saigon. As the CPK grew more powerful, it imposed increasing restrictions on Vietnamese forces still operating inside Cambodia. In 1972, Pol Pot proposed that Prince Norodom Sihanouk leave Beijing and tour the territories controlled by the CPK. When Sihanouk made the journey, he met several senior Khmer Rouge leaders, including Pol Pot himself, although Pol Pot's true identity was carefully concealed from the prince.
In May 1973, Pol Pot ordered the forced collectivization of villages in areas under Khmer Rouge control. This decision was driven by both ideology and strategy. Ideologically, it aligned with the goal of creating a socialist society without private property. Tactically, it gave the Khmer Rouge tighter control over food supplies, preventing farmers from feeding government troops. The policy immediately provoked resistance. Many villagers, furious at the loss of their property, slaughtered their own livestock rather than allow it to become collective property. Over the next 6 months, an estimated 60,000 Cambodians fled from Khmer Rouge-controlled territory. At the same time, the movement introduced conscription to strengthen its military ranks. Relations with North Vietnam remained tense. When the North Vietnamese temporarily reduced arms shipments to the Khmer Rouge, the CPK Central Committee met in July 1973 and redefined Vietnam as a friend with a conflict. Pol Pot responded by ordering the detention of Khmer Rouge members who had previously lived in North Vietnam and were suspected of being too sympathetic toward Vietnamese interests. Most of those detained were later executed. In the summer of 1973, the Khmer Rouge launched its first major assault on Phnom Penh. The attack failed, and the movement suffered heavy losses. Later that year, the city came under sustained artillery bombardment. During the autumn, Pol Pot relocated to a base at Troc Sday on the eastern slopes of the Cardamom Mountains. By winter, he had returned to the Chinit River base, where he held strategic discussions with Sari and Chea. From these meetings emerged a critical shift in direction. Pol Pot concluded that the Khmer Rouge should openly declare its commitment to transforming Cambodia into a socialist society and begin a covert campaign to weaken Prince Sihanouk's influence. In September 1974, the Central Committee convened at Meek in Prek Kok Commune. There, the leadership reached one of its most radical decisions yet: the complete evacuation of Cambodia's cities and the forced relocation of urban populations to rural villages. The Khmer Rouge believed this was essential to destroying capitalism, which they saw as deeply rooted in urban life and culture. By 1974, the government of Lon Nol was rapidly losing support, both inside Cambodia and abroad. Morale collapsed, and by early 1975, the troops defending Phnom Penh began openly discussing surrender. On 17 April 1975, they laid down their arms, allowing the Khmer Rouge to enter the capital. Once inside the city, Khmer Rouge forces executed between 700 and 800 senior government officials, military officers, and police commanders. Other high-ranking figures managed to escape. Lon Nol fled into exile in the United States, leaving Sao Kham Khoi as acting president.
Just 12 days later, Saukom Khoi also fled the country aboard a departing U.S. Navy ship. Within Phnom Penh itself, Khmer Rouge militias operating under different zone commanders clashed with one another. These confrontations stemmed partly from territorial rivalries and partly from confusion over who was genuinely a member of the movement and who was not. For years, the Khmer Rouge had regarded the population of Phnom Penh with deep suspicion. The city had grown dramatically as rural peasants fled the advancing Khmer Rouge forces, and these refugees were viewed as traitors to the revolution. Shortly after taking control, the Khmer Rouge announced that the entire population must evacuate immediately to escape an imminent U.S. bombing campaign. They falsely claimed that residents would be allowed to return after just 3 days. In reality, the evacuation was permanent. More than 2.5 million people were forced out of Phnom Penh with almost no warning or preparation. Between 15,000 and 20,000 hospital patients were dragged from their beds and compelled to march alongside the rest of the population. Checkpoints were set up along the roads where Khmer Rouge cadres searched evacuees and confiscated many of their possessions. The march took place during the hottest month of the year, and an estimated 20,000 people died along the way from exhaustion, dehydration, and illness. For the Khmer Rouge leadership, emptying Phnom Penh was not merely a military or logistical decision. It was seen as the destruction of capitalism itself, which they associated with urban life. It also dismantled Prince Sihanouk's power base and what they believed to be an extensive network of U.S. Central Intelligence Agency spies. By clearing the cities, the Khmer Rouge consolidated their control over Cambodia and forced the urban population into agricultural labor, laying the foundation for their radical vision of a peasant-based socialist state. The Cambodian Civil War was over. The capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, fell to the Viet Cong just 13 days later on the 30th of April 1975, as Western efforts to stop the spread of socialist regimes in Southeast Asia ended in dismal failure in the spring of 1975. The Cambodian Civil War was over. Approximately 250,000 Cambodians had been killed in nearly 8 years of conflict, but few knew what the future now held in store for the country. Despite being the main rebel organization during the Civil War, the Khmer Rouge was something of an unknown quantity. In international circles, Pol Pot and his party were viewed as something of an ancillary to the Viet Cong presence in Cambodia. Few, though, knew what they would do once in power, nor could they have predicted the scale of the brutality, which would now be unleashed throughout the country. Even Pol Pot himself was a relatively shadowy figure, of whom the world knew little in 1975, but that would all change in the years that followed. Having seized power, the Khmer Rouge unleashed a savage assault on Cambodian society itself, the horrors of which have been eclipsed by few regimes in human history. At the center of the nightmare that unfolded in the months and years following the end of Cambodia's civil war was a single force: the ideological project of the Communist Workers' Party of Kampuchea, led by Pol Pot. This movement had been growing for over a decade, ever since it began quietly building its strength in the jungles of northeastern Cambodia during the mid-1960s. The party was fully committed to the idea of an agrarian revolution, one in which rural peasants would form the foundation of a new communist state. Yet despite its revolutionary language, Pol Pot himself had only a shallow understanding of Marxist theory. In fact, the ideology developed by the Khmer Rouge bore little resemblance to the ideas of Karl Marx and often stood in direct opposition to them. Marx had envisioned a revolution driven by the urban proletariat, oppressed factory workers rising against industrial capitalism. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge believed the opposite. They viewed city dwellers and industrial workers as dangerous, corrupt, and subversive. In their vision, Cambodia's future lay not in the cities, but in the countryside. Urban life, they believed, had to be dismantled entirely, and the population forced back to the land to create an almost exclusively agrarian society. What they imagined as a utopian transformation would soon become a devastating nightmare for the Cambodian people. After the fall of Phnom Penh in April 1975, Pol Pot moved swiftly. He entered the capital on April 20 and by May had established his government in the Silver Pagoda, a lavish 19th-century royal complex that had once housed Cambodia's monarchy. At first, it was not entirely clear that Pol Pot and the Communist Party would dominate the new political order. Several regional military leaders still controlled their own power bases, and in the autumn of 1976, there was even an attempt to remove Pol Pot from leadership. Ultimately, however, the party prevailed and consolidated total control.
In January 1976, the country was officially renamed Democratic Kampuchea. Power was vested in a standing committee composed of senior Khmer Rouge leaders who referred to one another as brothers. Pol Pot became brother number 1 and served as prime minister. For a brief period, the former king, Norodom Sihanouk, was brought into the government, largely to prevent him from becoming a rallying point for opposition. But by the spring of 1976, Sihanouk resigned and was placed under house arrest, another neutralized threat. In this way, the Khmer Rouge secured their grip on Cambodia during the first year after the war. The policies Pol Pot and his regime pursued in the late 1970s would soon become infamous. As already seen, the Khmer Rouge structured their state around the idea of a radical agrarian revolution, built on what they considered a rural proletariat. Pol Pot and his allies drew inspiration from Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward in China 2 decades earlier, an ambitious campaign intended to rapidly increase agricultural and industrial production. That campaign had ended in catastrophic failure, contributing to the deaths of as many as 50 million people. Yet undeterred by this grim precedent, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge attempted to replicate similar methods in Cambodia, hoping to dramatically expand the country's agricultural and manufacturing output in just a few years. Their ultimate objective was complete self-sufficiency. Cambodia, they believed, should rely on no foreign power for its survival, especially not Vietnam, its larger and more influential neighbor to the east. This vision of independence was to be achieved through collectivization. Farms across the country were placed under state ownership and operated communally. The regime sought to increase output by forcing people to work relentlessly, regardless of cost. To accomplish this, the Khmer Rouge immediately began evacuating Cambodia's cities, forcing millions into the countryside and into labor camps where they worked on collective farms. Conditions in these camps were brutal. They amounted to little more than slave labor. Workers were beaten or tortured if they failed to meet impossible quotas. Food rations were deliberately kept low, often so that camp officials could falsely report higher production figures. Malnutrition quickly became widespread, followed by starvation and death. As conditions worsened throughout 1976 and 1977, disease spread rapidly through the camps, pushing death rates even higher. Anyone who resisted orders, worked too slowly, or questioned authority risked execution. The labor camps were not the only sites of mass killing. The Khmer Rouge established one of the most extreme totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Deeply xenophobic, rigidly classist, and violently authoritarian. Middle and upper-class Cambodians were targeted simply for their education, professions, or perceived links to past governments. This occurred despite Pol Pot himself having come from an upper-middle-class background.
Ethnic minorities were also singled out. Between 1975 and 1979, approximately 250,000 ethnic Chinese Cambodians were killed. An estimated 100,000 Muslims were also murdered. Foreigners were hunted down, and the regime declared itself officially atheistic. Buddhism, long central to Cambodian life, was savagely suppressed. Anyone suspected of opposing the regime faced arrest, torture, and execution. Across the country, more than 150 detention, torture, and execution centers were established. The most notorious was S-21,
a former secondary school in Phnom Penh, through which as many as 20,000 prisoners passed between 1976 and 1979. Almost none survived. As time passed, paranoia consumed every level of Cambodian society. Children were indoctrinated and sometimes forced to take part in executions. In other cases, the children of political dissidents or ethnic minorities were killed alongside their parents, based on the belief that they might one day seek revenge. These atrocities took place in what became known as the killing fields, sites scattered across Cambodia where mass executions were carried out. Victims were often killed with farming tools, sharpened bamboo, scythes, or pickaxes to conserve ammunition. Some were forced to dig their own graves before being executed. In many cases, ordinary peasants were compelled to carry out the killings themselves, under threat of death if they refused. What the Khmer Rouge claimed was a revolutionary rebirth became one of the most devastating genocides of the 20th century. The scale of the Khmer Rouge's brutality was so vast and the terror it unleashed so absolute that by the end of the 1970s, an estimated 1.7 to 2.2 million people out of a population of roughly 8 million had been killed. The Khmer Rouge genocide, overseen by Pol Pot and carried out by the Khmer Rouge, stands as one of the most extreme and vicious atrocities of the 20th century. The sheer magnitude of the violence makes it difficult to identify any coherent system of governance beneath it. What policies did exist were inseparable from the regime's ideological fanaticism and totalitarian paranoia. Education, for example, was transformed into a tool of repression. Following the fall of Phnom Penh in 1975, several thousand teachers and educators were executed across the city. A new curriculum was introduced that taught little beyond basic literacy and arithmetic, with most classroom time devoted to indoctrinating children with the regime's political ideology. Some of these children were later molded into enthusiastic participants in the state's violence.
The healthcare system collapsed almost entirely. Doctors and trained medical professionals were targeted and executed on class grounds, leaving the population with little access to proper treatment. Economically, the regime abolished money altogether, replacing it with a barter system and state-controlled distribution of goods. As a result, Cambodians were forced to trade their remaining personal possessions simply to obtain food and basic necessities. Foreign trade all but disappeared. Most striking of all, the Khmer Rouge's central objective to massively increase agricultural output failed catastrophically. Instead of abundance, famine became widespread. As the months turned into years, hunger and starvation spread across the country. In foreign policy, Pol Pot pursued the same goal that shaped every aspect of his rule: complete self-sufficiency. Isolationism was embraced. Western nations, including the United States, were rejected outright, in part due to their association with the previous government in Phnom Penh. The regimes Pol Pot did befriend were often led by fellow autocrats, such as Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu. Despite its status as the leader of the communist world, the Soviet Union was largely spurned. Instead, Democratic Kampuchea aligned itself with China. Chairman Mao committed more than $1 billion in aid to help rebuild Cambodia after the Civil War, and Chinese civil and military advisors were dispatched to assist with economic and strategic planning. However, this relationship cooled significantly after Mao's death in 1976 and as the Khmer Rouge grew increasingly hostile toward ethnic Chinese Cambodians.
The most consequential relationship, however, was with Cambodia's eastern neighbor, Vietnam. After the Civil War, relations between Cambodia and a newly unified Vietnam deteriorated rapidly. In the summer of 1976, talks aimed at resolving border disputes collapsed. Although relations briefly stabilized afterward, few Cambodians could have imagined that Vietnam would soon become their unlikely source of salvation. By 1978, relations between Phnom Penh and Hanoi were in terminal decline.
In December 1977, Vietnamese forces crossed into disputed border regions with tens of thousands of troops and severed diplomatic ties, though they withdrew in early 1978. Pol Pot responded by ordering cross-border raids into Vietnam. While war had not yet been formally declared, the violence ignited resistance within Cambodia itself. As chaos and brutality intensified, several regional military commanders began distancing themselves from the regime. Desperate to reinforce his legitimacy, Pol Pot attempted to court former King Norodom Sihanouk, still under house arrest, seeking his public support. The move revealed the regime's growing isolation and desperation. In December 1978, the conflict finally erupted into full-scale war. On Christmas Day, Vietnamese forces launched a massive attack of Cambodia. More than 150,000 troops, many of them experienced veterans of the Vietnam War and led by seasoned commanders, poured across the border. The advance was swift and overwhelming. By the end of 1978, northeastern Cambodia had fallen, and on New Year's Day 1979, the main Vietnamese forces began their march toward Phnom Penh.
The reign of the Khmer Rouge was entering its final days. As resistance from the Cambodian army collapsed in the opening days of 1979, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge began evacuating the capital. Senior leaders scattered, many fleeing across the border into Thailand, while Pol Pot himself headed northwest toward Battambang. On January 7, 1979, Phnom Penh fell to Vietnamese forces. Almost immediately, a new government was installed, the People's Republic of Cambodia, led by Cambodian exiles who had previously fled to Vietnam to escape Pol Pot's purges. At first, the war appeared decisively over. The Khmer Rouge seemed utterly defeated. But once again, Cambodia became the stage for great power intervention. In mid-February 1979, China launched an invasion of northern Vietnam. Although the Sino-Vietnamese War lasted less than a month and ended with a ceasefire by mid-March, the attack halted Vietnamese momentum in Cambodia. Crucially, it gave the Khmer Rouge and other armed groups time to regroup and reorganize. Taking advantage of this distraction, Pol Pot and his remaining forces re-established control over parts of northwestern Cambodia along the Thai border. With renewed financial and military support from China and the United States, Pol Pot attempted to reinvent the Khmer Rouge during the summer of 1979. The movement publicly distanced itself from its socialist past and from its earlier atrocities. Pol Pot sought to recast himself as the leader of a new patriotic democratic front, a loose coalition of political and military factions opposed to the Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh. In an extraordinary attempt at self-reinvention, Pol Pot even abandoned his infamous pseudonym, adopting the name Phem after his father. Remarkably, these efforts gained some traction internationally. In November 1979, despite the regime's recent crimes, many of which were still not fully known, the United Nations recognized the Khmer Rouge as the legitimate government of Cambodia, rather than the administration installed in Phnom Penh. By the end of the first year of the Cambodian-Vietnamese War, the stage was set for a prolonged confrontation. Vietnam and its allied government in Phnom Penh now faced a patchwork of militant groups controlling much of the countryside. The Khmer Rouge was only one of these factions. In effect, Cambodia had entered a new civil war, one that would last nearly as long as the conflict that had first brought Pol Pot to power in 1975.
The war continued for another decade. Alongside the Khmer Rouge, one of the most significant opposition groups was Funcinpec, the National United Front for an Independent, Neutral, Peaceful, and Cooperative Cambodia, founded in 1981 by former King Norodom Sihanouk. In response, Pol Pot made another ideological shift. That same year, he officially dissolved the Communist Party of Kampuchea and announced the creation of a new nationalist movement, underscoring his continued political flexibility. As the conflict dragged on through the mid-1980s, fought largely through guerrilla warfare in Cambodia's jungles and foothills, Pol Pot gradually retreated from the forefront of the movement. In September 1985, he resigned as military commander of the Khmer Rouge. This decision was driven partly by military setbacks. Vietnamese forces had pushed Khmer Rouge units into Thailand the previous year, and partly by deteriorating health. In 1983, Pol Pot had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a serious form of cancer that required extended medical treatment in Bangkok and Beijing. By the late 1980s, as the war ground on without resolution, Pol Pot began signaling, both domestically and internationally, that he no longer sought to return to power. Instead, he claimed, his sole objective was the removal of Vietnamese forces from Cambodia. As with many of his pronouncements, this shift reflected broader geopolitical realities. Across the world, the communist bloc was collapsing, and the Cold War was nearing its end. Vietnam, long isolated on the global stage, moved to extricate itself from Cambodia. In 1988, Hanoi began withdrawing nearly 100,000 troops and initiated political and economic reforms designed to sustain the People's Republic of Kampuchea without direct military support. By September 1989, the last Vietnamese troops had left Cambodia. The long war was finally drawing to a close, but Cambodia's suffering was far from over. After a ceasefire was declared in 1990, peace negotiations began among Cambodia's rival factions in an attempt to stabilize the shattered country. Despite its crimes while in power between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge, still led by Pol Pot, was included in these talks. Pol Pot himself remained hidden in a remote area near the Thai-Cambodian border, sending his close associate Khieu Samphan to Phnom Penh as the movement's representative. Negotiations largely revolved around three figures: Samphan, former king Norodom Sihanouk, and Hun Sen, leader of the Vietnamese-backed government.
Samphan adopted a confrontational stance, declaring that the Khmer Rouge would not disarm its forces in western Cambodia. In response, Hun Sen and Sihanouk remained equally unyielding. As a result, sporadic fighting continued throughout the early 1990s, even as peace talks dragged on. Eventually, it was agreed that national elections would be held in the early summer of 1993. The result was a decisive rejection of the Khmer Rouge. Parties aligned with Hun Sen and Sihanouk won nearly 80% of the vote. This marked the beginning of the end for both the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. Sihanouk entered into a coalition with Hun Sen, and the new government launched a military campaign against remaining Khmer Rouge strongholds in western Cambodia. Although Pol Pot briefly counterattacked in 1994, the movement was steadily collapsing. Desertions increased, morale collapsed, and by the mid-1990s, the Khmer Rouge controlled little more than a narrow stretch of territory along the Thai border, defended by only a few thousand fighters. Even so, it would take until 1999 for the Cambodian government to finally eliminate the movement that had terrorized the country in the 1970s. Pol Pot, however, did not live to see that final defeat. Born Saloth Sar in the 1920s, the man responsible for immense suffering in Cambodia met his downfall before his death. In 1997, with the Khmer Rouge at its lowest point, the remnants of the movement turned on their leader. Internal paranoia and factional conflict consumed the group, and in a coup led by Tom Mok, Pol Pot and his family were placed under house arrest. By this time, Pol Pot was gravely ill. He suffered from heart disease, had been partially paralyzed by a stroke, and required regular oxygen. His cancer had returned, and without proper medical care, his condition deteriorated rapidly. In a deeply ironic and hypocritical gesture, the Khmer Rouge placed him on trial in July 1997. He was sentenced to life imprisonment by the very organization he had led for more than 3 decades. That sentence was short-lived. Pol Pot died in April 1998. 6 days later, on April 21, he was cremated in a Buddhist ceremony.
One of the 20th century's most brutal dictators was gone, leaving behind a country scarred by landmines, trauma, and decades of authoritarian rule.
There is little debate about Pol Pot's place in history. In a century filled with mass murderers and tyrants, he stands out for the sheer scale and ferocity of the violence he unleashed. Between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge turned against virtually everyone within Cambodia's borders. Foreigners, intellectuals, religious figures, and political dissenters were targeted first, but the regime ultimately turned on its own people. Hundreds of thousands were worked to death in labor camps in a fanatical pursuit of agricultural productivity that instead produced famine. By the end of the 1970s, nearly 1 in every 4 Cambodians had been murdered or killed through starvation, disease, and execution. By 1979, even the United Nations and the Red Cross were warning that Pol Pot's regime was bringing about the near destruction of Cambodian society. Only the Vietnamese intervention that year brought the killing to an end. That is Pol Pot's legacy. There are no rational justifications for it, only devastation, loss, and a nation forever marked by one of history's darkest chapters. What do you think of Pol Pot? Was he the most tyrannical dictator of the 20th century? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching.